o los vas a esperar con las manos en la espalda o dispuesto a pelear.
Hey comrades, I'm Call Out Kathy, and I wanted to talk about the tactics of the Yellow Jacket protesters and why I think it's such a great model for participatory democracy. But before I get onto the Yellow Jackets, I have a public service announcement for you. And that is that if you see a trans woman getting angry and reacting out of anger after they have been misgendered in an intentionally harmful way, you should be giving them moral support. Cheer them on, applaud, say you go girl. It's time that we start fighting back against the hate crimes against the trans community. Also, by the way, passing is a transphobic concept and the gender binary is cancelled. Welcome to 2019. But now let's talk about the Yellow Jackets. First of all, what's the point of it all? Is it just anger? Are they just troublemakers? No. The reason why they protest is to try and get their demands heard. Because you see, they've been demanding things for a very long time, and their government has not been giving them those things that they've been demanding. Instead, their government has decided to go the other way, making their lives harder, trying to extract more labor from them for less pay. And that is why so many people are angry. Look at the power imbalance between the rich and the powerful and the working class and unemployed. So when that government abuses its most marginalized and hurting people, many of the French people decided to try and put a stop to it, to say enough is enough. But all protests by the week against the abuses of the strong are heroic. What makes the yellow vest so special? Well, believe it or not, it isn't actually the yellow vests. While that is a pretty great choice of outward unity, it doesn't matter what your symbol is. The symbol doesn't matter nearly as much as the actions being done and the demands being made. So if the vests aren't the things that are the most important, what is? I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think they're super effective. First of all, they're only protesting on the weekends. This means that things can kind of go back to normal during the week. Sure, it's inconvenient for people who might want to stay out of it or who can't participate, and they might end up needing to stay home on weekends, but at least during the week, those that were disturbed can recover, and for those who aren't yet involved, it sends a message that the protests aren't meant to be making their lives worse, they are being considerate and they are taking other people's concerns into account. They might have a problem with the government, but they don't want to change things so badly that they'll tear everything down in the process of trying to get what they want. This level of good faith and constraint allows the discussion to happen and the debate to go on about the protest without sending everyone into panic mode or triggering a super militarized response immediately. Because as we've seen before, when the crap hits the fan and things start falling apart too quickly, that just causes international actors to step in and intervene. And that's not what the protesters want. They want to fix things themselves. When protests completely grind everything to a shut, that just triggers a super authoritarian response from the government, and it shuts it down before it can even have a chance to grow. Secondly, they're accounting. Every week they protest, they're adding a number onto the name of the protest. This is extremely important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a timer and a counter. It keeps track of how long and how many protests have happened. And as the number goes up, people are always pointed back at the beginning of it as well, where they can see how the protest started, and so that it's harder for others to co-opt the movement. This sends a message to everyone that things are being kept track of, that there is an accountability. This shows people how inactive the government is, that they would let things go on that long. Secondly, it implies continuation. If I just were to start counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's no set logical point where the counting is meant to stop. It can go on for infinity. This sends a message to everyone that they're willing to keep fighting as long as it takes.
Nos aplastan, nos engañan, pero hora también llegará. Armas de barrio.
And the third thing that I found particularly profound about these protests is that they have been very strategic in the targets that they choose. The only reason their demands haven't already been met is because the working class is being exploited so much. Secondly, I'm talking about the targets as in where they are directing theirs. only at things like police, who are henchmen of the rich, politicians, government buildings, and things that aren't really other citizens, but purely the government and the government's henchmen. They also protest in tourist attractions rather than in the suburbs where the average working class person lives. This maximizes the disruption to the wealthy disproportionately to the working class. This is trying to make things better rather than tear them apart. So what does this mean for socialists and anarchists? Well, I think it means the French government is either going to end up being a fascist regime or a social democracy. We've seen in places like the USA, Brazil, Russia, etc., these authoritarian fascists coming into power, and I don't think we can ever discount the possibility of that happening. However, I get the feeling that there is quite a strong leftist movement in France, that there are a bunch of socialists and anarchists in the Yellow Jacket movement as well. And that's why I'm hopeful that the outcome will be positive and that they'll move to a more just system, even if it wouldn't be perfect. Now, why wouldn't they end up having a socialist or anarchist society after a revolution like this? Well, unfortunately, this is more of a bourgeoisie revolution, and that it's going to probably end up perpetuating capitalism. But that doesn't mean it's a net loss, because a neoliberal or fascist government being flipped into a social democracy can have real-world positive implications for people. I think you can only start talking about going to actual socialism and anarchism when you have at least 80% of your population on board for that kind of system. And trying to do it by force is something that I think is always going to fail and be really yikes in the process. There's just no shortcut. You need people to want the system that you're trying to implement. So hopefully in France, the system that they can all agree to implement for now will be social democracy, which would be better for them than what they had before, which was more neoliberal and moving towards the right. Now, obviously a social democracy isn't a perfect system, and it's still going to end up in a lot of suffering, abuse and oppression, because it's still founded on capitalism and still has social hierarchies as well as institutional hierarchies. All of the oppressions are still going to have a degree of institutional backing. However, a social democracy is slightly more sympathetic to the demands of its people. That gives them an opportunity to demand changes and actually get those implemented so that they can try to get some welfare for the people in need. Social policies like free education, free healthcare, giving everyone shelter and their basic necessities, even something like universal basic income, although that's kind of another debate altogether, can be achievable under a social democracy. These things that improve people's lives in material ways will give them the means to improve themselves. They'll be able to afford things like getting an education, financial security, maybe a more permanent place to stay, mobility, the healthcare that they need, more leisure, and more time to learn about the ideas of socialism and anarchism. These things can be used to push that adoptance of socialism and anarchism up so that we can get it to 80%. It's not the perfect environment, but it might be something we can do without a huge civil war, and it's something that the people around are actually going to be able to accept and live with. Social democracies are still going to be a dangerous place for activists, just not as dangerous as neoliberalism and much safer than fascism. Now, some people say, but if you achieve these things, you get your social democracy, your welfare, your free education and free healthcare. People are generally not in poverty anymore. They're just going to get complacent and they're not actually going to try and strive for anarchism or socialism. Well, to start with, I would argue if you can't get them to want anarchism and socialism while they're living in a social democracy, then maybe anarchism and socialism isn't even better than a social democracy. Surely if it's better, there must be a way to show people and convince them of how it is better. And as to complacency, have you seen how complacent the people in the USA, Brazil, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and all these other places that have fascists in power and that are on the brink of committing even more genocides than we've seen, who are collectively committing ecocide, and their populations seem to still be voting for them and generally complacent. When the hate crimes and the police brutality is going on, they're not having revolution. So I would argue that even under fascism, you're not going to get people to stop being complacent. It feels to me like it's just a cop-out. You'd rather live in the fantasy of a perfect society happening overnight than deal with the reality that it takes people months and years to change their worldviews. And in a place like France, not enough people have changed their worldviews yet, and there's not enough time for that. Maybe if these protests go on for months and years, that can happen. But it's going to be really difficult to sustain them that long without the government getting super authoritarian and forcing a decision. The other thing that can happen in social democracy, laws against hate crimes, laws against exploitation, and laws against corruption can be put into place and enforced to some degree. Sure, it's not perfect, but there are people in positions trying to do what they can. Now, I'm a utopian philosopher, but I just think we need to be practical about how we can get there. So if we can gain ourselves some kind of legal protections against the worst of the hate crimes, if we can get some kind of accountability when people act like fascists, if we can get the CEOs and the rich people to get taxed to heck, and to use those funds to help the poorest people in our societies, while trying to explain to people, teach them, and build movements for the permanent socialist and anarchist society where we can actually begin to eliminate poverty and suffering and start to reverse the climate apocalypse. We need to start having a more positive outlook. You can't reform your way into socialism, but reforms can buy you some breathing room so that you can actually start talking to people and having them listen to you about why capitalism is fundamentally bad, why concepts like money, trade, and private property only exist to enable exploitation and inequality, and that we can be more efficient, have more resources and more services available to us if we did away with money and markets, politicians, governments, and met each other's needs through mutual aid within self-governing united community. To me, that's something that's still going to be worth fighting for, even under a social democracy. And to be honest, with all of these fascist regimes popping all over the place, it's kind of getting urgent that we have an opposition to that, and maybe a whole bunch of social democracies starting to cooperate. Instead of being caught in this competitive neoliberal hellscape, maybe they can unite together, start to boycott these fascist regimes and try to gain protection for those people in those countries who are now going to be victimized. In other words, if you're horrified at the things happening around the world in places like Brazil, and you want to change that, you're going to need to convince your society to adopt collectivization and oppose fascism. If you'd rather have fascism than a social democracy, doesn't that just make you a fascist? Even if you think you really want socialism? And the reason why the movement in France is taking off like that is because people have been doing the work. Activists have been spreading the message. So I think we can learn a lot of lessons from the Yellow Jacket movement. Let's make this a no-chill year. Welcome to No Chill 2019. Bye.